Okay, so I am here today to talk about Past Lives of Leith, which is the book that I put together based on Headland Archaeology's work along the tram route in 2008 and 2009. There we go. Right. Sorry, this is the first time I've ever done a lecture on Zoom, by the way. I've done plenty standing in the same room as people, but this is a new experience, so we'll bear with me. Right, so here's the bit of the route covered in the book. You'll see it's the part of the route that wasn't actually built the first time round, although work is underway now. We found stuff along the whole of this bit of the route, including some skeletons at the junction of London Road and Leith Walk, just here. Can you see my map? The skeletons there probably relate to either the medieval chapel or the later friary that was there, but as time is limited, I'm going to focus just on the stuff we found at Conservation Street down here, which is not to be confused with guards excavations along the same bit of road last year. They found some other stuff, but obviously not. So what did we find at Conservation Street? Mainly an awful lot of dead people. We found the remains of 378 people outside of the existing graveyard of South Leith Parish Church, or St Mary's as was. Here, if you look at the slide, this is the excavation just starting. Because it was on the road, we had to do it in 10-meter blocks because we couldn't block the entire road off at the same time. We had to do one half of the road in 10-meter blocks and then come back the other way and do the other half of the road in 10-meter blocks. So it was interesting logistically. But you'll see here, there is the existing graveyard of St Mary's, and that's, you can just see the church there and the side. And it was assumed originally that the eastern side of the graveyard wall there was where it had always been. So it was somewhat of a surprise to find skeletons under the road here. That wasn't really expected, and they were just under the road as well, like just to lift the tarmac off, and you're about this far, you know, about a foot down, and we started finding the skeleton. So here's a close-up of this plan. You can't really see the plan because it's a very, very long, thin site. But this is what it looks like. Each of these rectangular shapes is a grave, and the blue ones were graves with coffins, and the pink ones were graves without coffins. And this crosshatched area here is where everything was disturbed by modern services going through. There was a big Victorian sewer, there were lots of electricity, gas pipes and everything gone through, which had either removed or obscured the skeleton. So either there wasn't anything to dig or we couldn't get to it. So quite a big chunk of the road was fell under that. Yeah, there was no archaeology left, and quite a big chunk of it, but we did have this good strip of decent archaeology going up the middle. But it meant that a lot of skeletons we got was partial skeletons. We had quite a few whole ones, but not as many as we would have hoped. So we radiocarbon dated 30 of the skeletons. The ones here with the labels, they were the ones that were dated. And this is where it got interesting. It was generally assumed that it was generally accepted that St Mary's was built in 1483, although there was no historical evidence for that exactly, but it does appear in historical records shortly after. But it was assumed that the skeletons would all be late 15th century and later. But actually, what we found is that burial at the site must have begun at least a century earlier. Radiocarbon dates aren't exact. They don't give you an exact date of when something happened. They give you a date range during which it probably happened. And in the late medieval period, they can be particularly vague. Some of the dates we got were like 2 centuries long. But 3 of the dates were definitely earlier than 1483, and it's quite probable that quite a few others were as well. So it's probable that burial at the site began around 1380, which is a period when Leith was undergoing lots of other improvements. There was the foundation of the Fraternity of Mariners. There were improvements to the harbour made from about 1398 onwards. So it's the late 14th century is when it was all happening for Leith. The early dates were all from the middle of the excavated area. So it looks like there was a smaller graveyard there originally, which must have been attached to a chapel, which is not historically recorded and is previously completely unknown. And it is quite probably the earliest ecclesiastical establishment in Leith, almost certainly in South Leith. It's possible that there was an earlier chapel over the river in North Leith, but again, that's not historically definite either. So to turn to the burials themselves, what do we do with them? Well, we could look at how they were buried, where they were buried, when they were buried, and then we can have specialists look at the bones, and you can tell an awful lot about a person's life and possibly death from looking at their bones. We also did special scientific analysis on their bones, by which you can tell what proportion of their diet was based on marine resources like fish and what proportion was from land-based resources like meat. And we also did analysis of their tooth enamel, whereby you can tell where they spent their childhood. So you can tell if they were local or not, and potentially you can tell where they were, if they weren't local, you can tell where they were from. And we also did quite a few facial reconstructions. We had about 47 of these done by interns at the University of Dundee. The reconstructions are based on the shape of the skull, and you can see roughly what they would have looked like. A lot of the detail you have to make up, hair color, eye color, etc. You just have to base on ethnic norms, but it's one possible face that could have hung on that skull. And apparently, I'm told, they would have been recognizable by their relatives based on these reconstructions. It's the same sort of thing they do for murder victims. So what did we find out from all of this? We found out that people were generally poor, hungry, and were used to hard work and had bad teeth, which is pretty much what you discover about any past populations to greater or lesser degrees. Things were hard in the past. Very few people made it past their 40s. Only 3 people out of the whole 378 were osteologically over 45, which is a very, very low figure, even for medieval times. So either Leith was a particularly unpleasant place to live, or possibly old folks were being buried elsewhere. They were also shorter than average for the period, which also implies things were quite hard in Leith. The average for men was 5'7", which is half an inch below medieval average. And for women, it was 5'1", which is 1.5 inches below medieval average. There were quite a few accidents and injuries, generally minor accidents and injuries. We didn't come across any fatal accidents. And they became more common in the later burials. So it seems that as Leith grew and became, as the population grew and the town became more dangerous and crowded, and people were having lots of minor accidents and fights and turned ankles and what have you. Out of the 6 adults that we tested the tooth enamel for, 4 of them turned out to be incomers, which is quite a high proportion, but it's what you'd expect for a port with lots of traffic coming and going. We can't tell exactly where they're from. You can just tell they're not local. It could be they're from Glasgow. Some of them could have been from North Berwick or East Lothian Way or Fife. It could well be that they were from further afield, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to tell. You can only tell that it's people from places with similar kind of geology. The diet was, on average, the average Leither had a diet that was about 17% based on marine resources, so 17% fish or shellfish, but it varied quite a lot. It varied from 0% to about 31%. So more meat might mean that they lived inland or just didn't like fish. More fish might mean that they had a more pious observance of the church ban on eating meat on certain days. It wasn't just Fridays you weren't allowed to eat meat. It was at various times during the medieval period. It could be Mondays, Wednesdays, various saints' days, the whole of Lent. At its height, it was about a third of the days a year you weren't actually allowed to eat meat. So monks and priests, for example, tend to show quite high proportions of fish in their diet. So it was a more kind of a pious thing. In terms of how they were buried, most people were buried without coffins, which is the normal for the medieval period. They may have been brought to the grave in a coffin, wrapped in a shroud, but then taken out of the coffin and placed into the ground just in the shroud. About a fifth of people were buried in coffins. There were at least 2 examples of this kind of slat-based coffin. Medieval coffins generally have made with longitudinal boards running up this way and with a solid base. This isn't a trick of the light. They really are kind of open slats. They're just boards that cover about half the base, and they appear to be reused boards as well. So we're assuming this was just a money-saving thing and they were a cheaper sort of coffin. We assume that the base would have been covered with some sort of cloth, so you weren't actually having bits of, dead people's fingers hanging out from underneath the bottom of the coffin. But it appears to be a local kind of a thing. I haven't seen any examples of this anywhere else, but there were 2 examples from excavations at St Giles Cathedral. There was a possible example in Perth, but that might be a different kind of a thing. But I haven't found any examples of them in England. So it appears to be a local kind of phenomenon, although I don't know why it should necessarily apply to Edinburgh. Surely people wanted cheap coffins everywhere. But anyway, there were quite a few multiple burials. That is between 2 and 4 people in one grave. We didn't have any mass graves like you get in some plague cemeteries, but I'm assuming that most of the multiple graves relate to times of high mortality, and these are people who died at the same time. They were mostly women and children in the multiple graves, and there were no signs of violent deaths, so it doesn't look to be warfare related, but it could well be times of famine or disease. There were also 3 north-south burials. I'll show you here on this plan. I don't know if you can see this, but there's one here, and then there's a pink one just underneath it, and then there's another one here. And now, most Christian burials, as you probably know, are buried east-west with their heads to the west. But in Leith, specifically in Leith, there seems to be a custom of burying some plague victims, not all, but some plague victims north-south. It's been seen at 2 other Leith sites, St Mary's Primary School, where they would and those burials are definitely connected to the 1645 plague outbreak, and Balmerino House, and there's good reason to suspect that the Balmerino House skellies will also relate to the 1645 plague outbreak. Now here, these 3 burials definitely predate 1645, but there are reasons to suspect that at least one of them was a plague victim, because this lady here, you can see her, she seems to have been buried hurriedly in a badly cut grave wearing her clothes. if you can see that this isn't just a funny angle that it's been taken at. That's her pelvis. There's her head up there. That's her feet. Her pelvis really is lower than her feet and her head. So she's kind of in a V-shaped grave cut, and she's just been kind of thrown in. And we also found quite a few of these little wire eyelets buried with her, some of them still embedded in some cloth. That's remains of cloth there. And they're about 1 centimeter across. And they're either from their eyelets, either from a corset or from a dress bodice, which implies she was wearing a dress. Whereas as opposed to the normal medieval rite whereby the body would be stripped and washed and wrapped in a shroud for burial, it's very unusual to get someone buried in their clothes. So which implies that there was either no one available and no one willing to dress the body properly for burial, and she was just thrown in the ground relatively hurriedly, which implies there was something odd about it. So possibly a plague victim. Now, while on the subject of plague, there were lots and lots of epidemics that went through Leith, not just the 1645 one. And the most famous one, obviously, the Black Death of 1349 to 51, which everyone knows about, but there were subsequent reoccurrences of plague for the next 300 years. The Black Death, by the way, is no longer really equated with bubonic plague the way it used to, because bubonic plague just doesn't behave like that. It spread far too quickly. Bubonic plague moves quite slowly. It was possibly a combination of bubonic plague, pneumonic plague, and septicemic plague, which is the same kind of pathogen, but just behaves in a different way. Pneumonic plague is where it gets into your lungs, and septicemic is when it gets into your blood and kills you very quickly. But equally, it could have been some sort of hemorrhagic fever like Ebola, or possibly something completely unknown. I think the jury is still out on it. Then there were repeated outbreaks of similar kinds of plagues for the next 300 years. There were also outbreaks of things like dysentery. There were quite a few things we don't know exactly what they were, like Le Queue in 1420 might have been some sort of pulmonary thing. The Wame ill seems to be some sort of gastric thing. Flying sickness might have been influenza. It's a bit of an inexact science because you've only got vague medieval.
No, the woman's talking, but I can't hear her.
Descriptions of it. Over 22 epidemics in a 300-year period, which means that there would have been 2 major epidemics every generation. So to live to the age of 60, you'd have to live through 4 of them, which maybe explains why a lot of people didn't live to the age of 60. The death toll for most of these is completely unknown. It could have been very serious, it could have been relatively mild. But the chances are somewhere like Leith, it would have been the death toll would have been quite high, because the town was crowded and unsanitary, and it had huge amounts of traffic, both local and foreign, which obviously spreads disease quite effectively. The only one where we know the death toll is the 1645 outbreak, the last plague outbreak, where it was recorded that 2,421 people died, which is an estimated half of the total population. Now, these types of diseases kill too quickly to leave any trace on the bones, so anyone in the graveyard might have died of one of these epidemics. I did quite a lot of research into plague in Edinburgh and Leith over the course of writing this site up, and several times found myself thinking along the lines of, thank goodness we don't have to live through anything like this anymore. And never for one moment did I ever imagine I'd be living through a global pandemic. But just to put this in perspective, to date, I looked it up this morning, 6.4% of the UK population have had COVID-19, and 126,927 people have died of it in the UK so far, which is a tragedy, and I'm not trying to make light of it. but to put it in perspective, it represents 0.2% of the UK population. And look at the massive effect it's had on our lives. So imagine living through a pandemic that kills a third or half the population. That's a half of everyone you know dead, whole families gone, whole villages gone. In the Middle Ages, they didn't understand that this was a virus. They didn't know how it was spread, and they just didn't know how to deal with it. The medieval attitude towards disease in general was that God afflicted you with it because you deserved it in some way. And that's why they were so suspicious of anyone offering healing services, because the only surefire way to heal anything was to pray and repent and lead a good Christian life. Scotland's very first response to the plague, to the Black Death, was, I'm afraid, to jeer at the English over it, because in 1350, it was assumed that the disease ravaging England at the time was the vengeance of God upon the English for, you know, being English. And so they decided to take advantage and invade, and they gathered in the forest in Selkirk and invaded the north of England. And funnily enough, most of the people that did died, and then brought the disease back to Scotland with them. So they didn't do that again. But the first historic record we have of practical efforts to curb the spread of plague was in 1456. And throughout the late 15th and 16th and 17th centuries, a series of measures evolved which could be brought out whenever needed. And Scotland was probably ahead of England in this respect, because it had relatively close ties to centres of learning in Italy and France and the Low Countries. So I thought it would be interesting to, from our perspective, to look at these measures and compare them with ours today, because there are some definite similarities there. Most of this, by the way, comes from a very good paper by Richard Oram, which I can recommend. You can find it online. I put the reference in the slide there if you're interested. So the measures they came up with were quarantining of infected people, which obviously we still do today, burning or fumigating of infected houses and other property, which we don't do today, but we don't need to because we could do it much more efficiently with disinfectant. Restrictions on population movements, check, yes. Shutdown of external trade and communications, less so, but again, mainly because we have disinfectant. Markets closed, yes. Schools closed, yes, they have been. Children, dogs and pigs kept off the street. Well, certainly I haven't seen any pigs on the streets of Leith for the last year, but children, no, because COVID thankfully generally spares children. So we don't have to worry about children being out on the streets, but there's plenty of diseases who will specifically seek out the very young. And if COVID was one of those, we wouldn't have seen kids on the streets for the last year. Wolf skins and hides impounded and burnt. They were particularly suspicious of wolf skins and hides in the medieval. They thought that they spread plague more than other things for some reason. So that happened a lot. Ships were quarantined and cleansed by being sunk and then refloated, which again, we have disinfectant these days, a lot more efficient. They had cleansers who were employed to undertake fumigations and bury the dead, which I think they got paid relatively well for this, because it was obviously extremely dangerous work, but they were also very, very unpopular because they were working unsupervised and they had a huge amount of power, and there must have been horrible abuses of that power. So it's just generally not good to have a visit from the cleansers. Death penalty for concealing cases of plague. We do not have that one anymore, which I'm quite glad of, but obviously there's still criminal implications. People have been prosecuted for breaking lockdown rules. And plague camps on Leith links. This is only during the 1645 outbreak. There were 2 plague camps on Leith links, which is what the bearers at St Mary's Primary School were about. That was one of the Leith links plague camps. There's no evidence that they had them before that. Before that, I think people were probably stuck in their own houses, but Again, we don't have play camps on these links these days, which I'm quite glad of. So to leave death and dying for a while and move on to the cheerier subject of warfare, violence, and religious intolerance. Arguably, the most dramatic episodes before Leith were the military campaigns of the mid-16th century. Leith was sacked twice in quick succession by English forces, both times under the Earl of Hertford in 1544 and 1547, during the Rough Wooing, where England were trying to force Scotland into a marriage union between the infant Mary Queen of Scots and the future Edward VI of England. Hertford reported that the town had defences of some kind, but it's not known what form these took or exactly where they were. After this, the Queen Regent, Mary of Guise, brought troops over from her native France to fortify the town, built state-of-the-art defences with artillery bastions designed by an Italian engineer, as shown on the Petworth map here. I love this map, it's brilliant. It's just to orientate you, it's drawn from the perspective of the Forth, so it's upside down as far as we're concerned. North is down and south is up. And so here's the Forth here. This is Leith, and there you can see Edinburgh in the distance. There's Arthur's Seat. That's Holyrood there. There's Edinburgh Castle, there's the Tronkirk. This over here is Restalrig, and there's Loch End Castle there. And there is Leith, and I think, and over here we've got Cannon Mills, I think, and these are all the various siege works. So the defences are shown here. The south side of the defences here roughly equates to the modern day Great Junction Street, and the eastern side here roughly equates to Constitution Street. So our excavations were around here. You can see St Mary's just there. So our excavations were about here-ish. I've got a close-up of this later. I'll show you in a minute. Now, religious tensions in the country were growing at the time as Scotland became more Protestant. The Catholic Mary of Guise was becoming more and more unpopular, and she ended up using fortified Leith as a refuge. And in 1559, the Protestant rebellion gathered momentum and invited English forces up to aid them. Leith was besieged for about a year. There was bombardment, there were skirmishes, assaults, fires. St Mary's was badly damaged. There were food shortages in Leith and increasing tensions between the occupying French and the locals, because the French were keeping most of the food for themselves. There is this kind of, entente cordiale whereby the Scottish and the French are great friends, but the French were essentially an occupying force in Leith at the time, and they were not popular. The siege ended in June 1560 with the death of Mary of Guise, and the defences were slighted so they couldn't be used again. Nearly a century later, in 1649, the defences were rebuilt in preparation for the arrival of Cromwell's army, and Cromwell ended up occupying Leith and making it a Scottish HQ after he defeated the Scottish forces at the Battle of Dunbar in 1650, and he remodeled the defences yet again. And we did find archaeological evidence of all of this excitement and warfare. We found these are two pieces of round shot, both found along Constitution Street, which must be related to one or other of these sieges. One of them is made out of stone, this one's stone, and this one's cast iron, and they're both more or less exactly the same size, about 2.5 inches in diameter. So they would have either been pieces of shot kept as part of the defensive arsenal, or they would have been lobbed at Leith by the English forces in the bombardment. But more than this, we also found evidence of the defences themselves, namely this ditch, which runs along most of the eastern side of the excavations here. You can see it here in close up, this wiggly line here, which we thought at first was a modern service cart. As you can see, all of these modern services here, but it's the way it's so wiggly, it was clearly hand dug, and it just didn't look like a modern service cut. So we concluded it must have been a ditch, a very, very big ditch. But because of the modern services just on this side of it, we didn't get much of it. So our interpretation of it has to be quite tentative, because we don't know exactly how wide it was. We don't know exactly how deep it was. It was at least a metre or two deep, I think, but we don't know exactly. So dating evidence also quite scant for it as well, and sometimes contradictory. The ditch could be either 16th or 17th century. Its location implies it's not 17th century because those defences survived long enough to be mapped in the 18th century. And there are two maps they appear on from 1709 and 1759. And we superimpose those on the modern street plan. And you can see that they don't quite match up, but here is the bank of the defences, the rampart as was, and it runs along here or along here, depending on which map you believe, but it's basically here to the east of our excavations, which means that the defensive ditch would have been outside the bank, so it would have been along here, along Wellington Place. And there was an excavation about the time I was writing this book on Wellington Place by another company, and they did find a big ditch which looks to be the 17th century defensive ditch. So we can say that our ditch is probably more likely to be the 16th century ditch, though I am prepared to be proven wrong on that and more evidence comes up. So here's a close-up of Leith from the Petworth map. So we think we have this bit of ditch here that runs along here. It does seem on this map to be quite a long way east of St Mary's, but anyway, it's our best fit theory. Now, assuming that was the 16th century ditch, it would have been cut through what was a working cemetery at the time, and it would have dug up some reasonably fresh bodies, which just would have increased ill feeling towards the French. And this is what we think this is. This looks to be a bit of a dead body that was still hanging together in some way when it was dug up and then was reburied. It's in a very unnatural position. That's the spine there, and it's very, very curvy. And then that's the pelvis, and the pelvis is at the wrong angle to the spine. And it doesn't have a head or arms or legs. So it looks to be a piece of decomposing, semi-decomposed corpse, which is still roughly hanging together, but in pieces, and then was just reburied, which is a deeply unpleasant thing to contemplate. But anyway, so altogether, we have evidence for what was happening in Leith from the period late 14th to 17th century, which is the period of town improvements, epidemics, sieges. Leith was growing in size, growing in population, growing in importance, becoming Scotland's leading port. And we also have a decent chunk of the physical remains of that population that we found. And we also discovered a fair amount about them. And then we had the 47 facial reconstructions. And so we thought it would be a good idea to put all of this together, and all of the information we'd learned about these people, their lives, their deaths, the times they lived in, and wrote a series of people's stories for the book. And there was a lot of stuff that I had to make up to fill in the gaps. The idea was to come up with a story of one possible life that would take into account who they were when they lived, what was going on at the time, the pathology of their bones, how they might have died, how they were buried, and anything else we knew about them. So I'm going to run through a couple of these just to show you what I mean. there was this guy first. There's a close-up of him, and there's his grave. Now this guy was really tall. He was 6 feet tall, which was 5 inches taller than average at the time. And he'd survived 6 broken ribs at one point. So I assumed he probably attracted a certain amount of trouble in the local alehouses due to his size. And I made him a bit of a bad boy, drinking, gambling, and cockfighting. And he had degenerative joint disease. He probably undertook heavy manual labor. So I made him a porter down at the docks, and also roped him into helping with the scheme to reclaim the land besides the King's Walk by dumping lots of waste on the beach to raise it above sea level, which we know happened in the 1460s. There was no evidence for how he died, so whatever it was probably killed him fairly quickly. So I had him die of ship's fever, which is one of the things, one of the names they had for typhus, which he contracted after drinking with some Spanish sailors. I had such good fun doing these. His position in the grave was odd. His head was raised up and it looks a bit squashed. So I had the grave diggers caught out by his huge height and were cutting the grave a bit too short for him, and there being this comic scene at the graveside where they had to hastily lengthen it while his drinking mates sniggered away. So that's that guy. Then there was this woman as well, who was buried there with a small child, with a toddler about 1 or 2 years old, I think. Now, taking her age and her likely date of death from the radiocarbon date gave her a birth date of around 1481, and tooth analysis suggested that she may have come from the East Linton area. She had parotid hyperostosis and cribra orbitalia on her skull, which together indicate that she was malnourished or chronically ill as a child, and she was also tiny at 4'9", which again implies a difficult childhood. So I had her moved to Leith with her husband after the plague outbreak of 1500, which would have left gaps in the employment market in Leith, and probably why a lot of people moved there. And also there was a famine in the countryside shortly before that, which I think when she was a child, so which would have explained why she was so small. And they had a tough time in town because it was assumed that country folk were assumed to be stupid because the literacy was higher. Literacy levels were higher in the country than the town, although they were still plenty high in the town. They would have had to live through another plague outbreak in 1504, which badly affected parts of Leith. Because of her general malnourishment and small size, it would have been difficult for her pregnancy would have been difficult for her. So I gave her a terrible time of it, losing 4 babies, and before she had a daughter that lived past a year. I had to assume that she was the mother of the child she was buried in. It wasn't necessarily so, but it made for a better story. But I needed to come up with a story about how they were both buried together and why in this opposition, facing each other and with the woman's elbow sticking out like this, which implies she wasn't wrapped in a shroud. It may have been to prop her up in this position looking at the child, or it may have been because that was the position she died in. It's quite a natural sleeping position, and by the time it came to move the body, rigor mortis had already set in, so they had to bury her and her infant daughter like this together in this odd position. So I had her die of smallpox at the same time as the child, and no one to help out for fear of contagion, so her husband delayed calling in the priest, and rigor mortis is set in, so they had to bury them in this position. And so forever looking at her daughter, which is a story that made me cry as I was writing it. But anyway, there was this lady here. We do not have a facial reconstruction of her because her skull was just too badly damaged, so I couldn't really tell her story for the book, but I want to tell it here because it's an interesting and very sad story. It's the skull of a woman, and she almost certainly died of syphilis. The pitting on the skull here is very characteristic of tertiary syphilis. She probably died between about 1465 and 1520, so a relatively early victim of the disease. Syphilis was first identified in the 1490s and spread rapidly through Western Europe. It was everywhere within a year or two. in Edinburgh, an early it was originally assumed that Christopher Columbus's crew brought it back from America, by the way, but that's not really accepted now, because there are a few examples of it having been found before 1493, but they don't really know where it came from. In Edinburgh, there were early attempts to control the spread of it and treat the victims in 1497 by quarantining them on Inchkeith Island in the Forth. Early treatments involved mercury, which wouldn't have done them any good at all. So this woman, because she's a relatively early victim, she may well have been on Inchkeith Island. She had a very, very high marine component to her diet. It was one of the highest we had. It was about 31%. So it's possible that if she was on Inchkeith Island, that they were supplementing their diet out there by picking shellfish off the foreshore. It's possible that she was the disfigurement of the disease meant she was outcast and she was having to scrape a living from the shore. Or it's possible that she was doing penance. Even before it was understood that syphilis was sexually transmitted, it was assumed that if you had it, you deserved it. So you must have done something to annoy God. So it's quite possible that she was living on a very humble fish diet to atone for whatever it was. And one more little story, just because I like this story. It's incredibly, incredibly gruesome. This is a adolescent. We don't know if it's male or female, but they were again buried in a very, very odd position, face down. Again, we don't have a facial reconstruction for this guy, but they were buried face down but tilting upwards, so the head was distinctly up and the whole body was kind of tilting up the way towards the head. There are several possible reasons for this, the most gruesome of which was suggested at a similarly positioned burial in Perth, where a woman was found like this with her arms out in front of her, like she was doing press-ups. This guy doesn't have any arms. We don't know what was going on with his arms, but it was suggested in Perth that she was in this position because she was accidentally buried alive and had managed to wriggle her way around and was trying to push her way out of her own grave. So that's a nice thought to be going on with. All of these stories do inevitably end in death, and most of them die before their time. So there's a certain amount of tragedy involved, but they also bring everything together, not just for the reader, but also for me. And they were great fun to write and useful for me to imagine what the history and living conditions that we described in the book were like to actually live through, what it's like to live through an epidemic that kills half your friends and family, what it's like to live through 3 of them and then be killed by a 4th one, what it's like to have your town sacked twice within 4 years. And it was fun to write. So if anyone is interested, the book is still available to buy, by the way. Here's the plug. You can get it from Museum of Edinburgh or from their online shop artuk.org, or you can send them an email. So there's the email address there. That said, they're not actually open at the moment, but they will be up and running from the middle of May onwards, but you can email them or order it now and they will then send you it in the middle of May if you want.